21. Perfection. A declaration in the law reads, "Thou shalt be perfect with the Lord thy God." Deuteronomy chapter 18, verse 13. This is restated in the Sermon on the Mount, Christ declaring, "Be ye therefore perfect, even as your Father which is in heaven is perfect." Matthew chapter 5, verse 48. The law does not command us to do what man cannot do. How, then, shall we understand this requirement, and wherein can we be perfect before the Lord without bearing false witness concerning ourselves? We are told that Noah was perfect, Genesis chapter 6, verse 9, and Abraham was called to be perfect, Genesis chapter 17, verse 1. In Psalm 37, verse 37, we have a reference to the perfect man as a fact of everyday life. In Psalm 101, verse 2, David declared, "I will behave myself wisely in a perfect way. I will walk within my house with a perfect heart." The Old Testament words translated as perfect mean upright, having integrity, blameless, and the New Testament words have the meaning of mature, complete. Clearly, this is something other than sinlessness. Lenski's comment is very much to the point with respect to the confusion of biblical perfection with sinlessness. The English translation perfect is largely responsible for the idea of absolute sinlessness, often given as the meaning, and it is unfortunate that we have no derivative from goal adequate to render the Greek. The fact that absolute sinlessness is not the thought expressed here we see from verse 6 of Matthew chapter 5, where the blessed disciples still hunger for righteousness, and from verse 7, where they still need mercy and are blessed by constantly obtaining it. Perfectionism may imagine that it is able to attain sinlessness in this life. This goal we shall not reach until we enter glory. Equally incorrect is the idea that in these expositions of the law, Jesus offers only counsels for the perfect, which are unattainable on the part of lesser Christians. Christ has no double standard. His greatest saints are found among the common believers, who by grace have become pure in heart. Verse 8. Perfection means uprightness and maturity in terms of a goal or purpose, an end established by God. Our maturity in heaven will include sinlessness, but our maturity here is of a different sort. In this life, we can be perfect in the sense of being blameless in our faithfulness to God's purpose, but to be blameless does not mean being faultless. Thus, G. Campbell Morgan once wrote of his experience with his young son. Morgan was in America, and a letter arrived from his son, who had just learned to read and write. The letter, full of errors, expressed the boy's love of his father and his longing for him. The letter, Morgan noted, was clearly not faultless, but it was blameless. The Berkeley version translates Deuteronomy chapter 18, verse 13. "You, however, must be blameless before the Lord your God." What is blameless in a child is not blameless in an adult. Maturity requires continuous growth towards God's appointed purpose. Then, too, the greater the responsibility, the greater the maturity required to be blameless. What a minister, a doctor, judge, or civil officer does, and in many cases what their wives do, is more important than what others do. A remark blameless in others may be a serious offence from them. To cite an example, Martha Mitchell, wife of U.S. Attorney General John Mitchell, is apparently a charming, intelligent, and witty woman. Her mouth is usually open. Her remarks have repeatedly had national news coverage, and many people have agreed with her. The effect of her remarks in Washington has been to widen breaches, stir up trouble, and create a number of unhappy problems. It is possible thus to say, with all due respect to Martha Mitchell as a superior woman, that she is blameworthy, and she has sought the limelight too often at the expense of the administration's policies. Even when ordered by her husband to be silent, she managed to get into the news. For months now, the lady's outspoken statements have been conspicuously missing from the press, in obedience, no doubt, to an injunction from U.S. Attorney General John Mitchell. Henceforth, he has decreed, if his wife Martha must speak out in public, it must be in Swahili. But what husband has ever silenced his wife? Administering the oath of office to the new president of the American newspaper Women's Club in Washington last week, Martha spoke in near-faultless Swahili. Jeunabi kwa kweli kwamba usaziunga, ruled the Attorney General, who was present. The oath in Swahili is perfectly legal. This kind of witty and irrepressible desire to make news is entertaining from a distance. For those near at hand, it's a problem, and it does represent thoughtlessness of consequences. And biblical perfection or maturity is not geared to the moment, but to God's ordained goals. The influence of pietism has been an important one in modern history, and it has borne false witness concerning God's requirements. Its emphasis on sinless perfection has in fact begotten sin. Where men expect a sinless perfection of other men, they are readily led into sinful intolerance of human frailties. This sinful perfectionism especially abounds at the end of an age, or in any era where men find their problems either temporarily or permanently insurmountable. Where problems are insoluble, men then turn on one another. Their basic unhappiness over the insoluble problems manifests itself in trying to dissolve from their midst people who irk them. As the fall of Rome began to loom, men long before had fled from the cities, recognizing their hopeless future. Their reaction, however, was far from sound. Christians and pagans alike turned on men and renounced them, becoming desert hermits. But being alone solved nothing, and the inner torments of these desert refugees indicated that their flight gave them neither peace nor an answer to the world's problems. Today again, as problems appear to be insoluble, the irritation of man with man increases. There is a low level of tolerance with children, neighbours, husbands, wives, friends, and associates. Instead of solving problems, this kind of perfectionism only aggravates them. Giving an exaggerated emphasis to human frailties is to bear false witness concerning them. The law here is plain spoken. Bear ye one another's burdens, and so fulfill the law of Christ. Galatians chapter 6, verse 2. This has reference very clearly, as Galatians chapter 6, verses 3 to 5 makes clear, to our faults and weaknesses. We are to recognize that each of us has a burden of weaknesses, and every man shall bear his own burden. Galatians chapter 6, verse 5. We sometimes need correcting, but much of the time we must live together mindful of our common frailties and work together to gain that maturity which comes from seeking first the kingdom of God and His righteousness. Matthew chapter 6, verse 33. Our greatest strength is thus in what is termed perfection, and which means maturity, and integrity in terms of God's purpose, which gains God's blessing, even amidst serious troubles. Maturity is the ability to grow in terms of our experiences and to use them to draw closer to God's purpose for us. The problem, from the modern perspective, is too often seen as subversion, when it is more commonly a moral failure, inability to grow and become mature. Societies which concentrate on problems of subversion are near death. They have lost their capacity to cope with their problems. This does not mean that subversion is to be neglected or condoned, but the only permanent answer to it is growth. The cause is reconstruction. During the War for Independence, the subversives, ostensibly on the American side, were undoubtedly many. It now is maintained that Benjamin Franklin was a British agent during the entire struggle. At least through the War of 1812, the number of British and French agents in America were numerous, but the basic health of the leadership and a sufficient element of men of character, plus the grace of God, enabled the American cause to prosper in the face of radical subversion. Without that maturity, no cause can survive. Without the ability to grow in terms of a goal, no cause can endure merely by rooting out its subversive elements. The salt that has lost its savour is good for nothing but to be cast out and to be trodden under foot of men. Matthew chapter 5, verse 13. There is no divine protection for men and nations who lose their calling and savour. In fact, there is then no escaping judgment. It is as if a man did flee from a lion, and a bear met him, or went into the house, and leaned his hand on the wall, and a serpent bit him. Amos chapter 5, verse 19.